Good evening, everyone. We are lucky in central New Jersey to be able to bring speakers from Princeton University to our lectures. But in this series, speakers have also come from Columbia University and the University of Pennsylvania. And tonight, our speaker is from Rutgers University. James Johnson is a professor in the Department of Religion and an associate in the graduate program in political science. So he combines religion and politics. He is no stranger to Princeton, however, since he earned his graduate degrees here. James Johnson has been called the eminent historian of just war theory. The list of his publications and presentations indicates this long-standing area of writing and research. Recently, he has written and spoken about such issues as the holy war idea in Western and Islamic traditions, responding morally to global terrorism, just war and jihad, the war and religion in the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. Professor Johnson's speaking engagements have taken him across the US, Europe, and the Middle East. Last year, he was invited by the Sultanate of Oman to speak on the place of religion in American public life. The second of these lectures, in which he discussed the vigorous presence of religion in our pluralistic society, was given in the Grand Mosque in the capital city of Muscat. He has also attended conferences and forums involving intellectuals from many countries in discussion of these issues. The subject of his lecture tonight, the religious and the secular from different cultural perspectives, the US, the Arab world, and France, derives in part from that experience. Please welcome James Johnson.
Okay, I need to ask you if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. I had somehow expected a more intimate setting. I guess I was thinking of one of the amphitheaters in the basement of the Wilson School or something like that. But I'm a bit awed by this. When I remember my college physics courses at Brown, and at that time, so little was known about physics that they could get it all on two of these boards. But alas, things have changed. This is going to be very informal. I didn't realize that anyone was describing me as eminent. It reminds me of the French Jesuit that a Catholic friend of mine was telling me about, who, upon being elevated to cardinal, began referring to himself as mon éminence. I promise I will not do that. I am basically going to tell a story and work in some, I hope, edifying comments around the story. Some of you may know Sam Huntington's original Clash of Civilizations article that appeared in Foreign Affairs some years back, and the debate that ensued about it. I was struck by the fact that the people who engaged in that debate made no reference whatsoever to a comment that appears at the very end of that article. And by the way, that article, which has the phrase, the clash of civilizations, in it, is followed by a question mark. That phrase is followed by a question mark there. So it was not a declarative thing, but a question as to whether we were leading there. Sam ends the piece by suggesting that if we would only engage in a dialogue to try to understand one another across cultural lines, we might avert the possibility of a clash of civilizations. Now, I think it's too bad that people didn't pick up on this. There were a whole variety of reasons why not, mostly having to do with the personal agendas of the critics. But Sam Huntington himself has been a very committed advocate of intercivilizational dialogue and where religion is concerned in the scheme of things in such a dialogue. So I resonated very strongly to that particular passage. Beginning back in the late 80s, I had expanded my interest in Western moral tradition on warfare to do some comparative look at the Islamic tradition, the idea of jihad, where it fits into the Islamic conception of statecraft and how this is being used both historically and contemporaneously in Islamic thinking. At any rate, all of this began to coalesce in my own experience back after the 9/11 attacks, when I was approached by a group of people that were associated loosely with the Institute for American Values in New York. I was approached to be asked whether I would like to become a signer of a particular statement that a number of people associated with this institute had put together, a statement called A Letter from America, What We're Fighting For, A Letter from America. I agreed to do this and became one of 60 intellectuals, as we were characterized, who signed it. A very, very broad group. Huntington was there, Michael Walzer was there, Jean Betke-Elshtain, who was one of the authors of the document, was there. Michael Novak, and if you know Mike, you know that he's at the other end of the spectrum from Michael Walzer. It was a very, very broad-ranging group of people, and I was happy to be one of this truly eminent group of people. The document was not publicized very much in the U.S. because the point really was to make a statement to the Arab world and to Europeans who were already becoming critical of the American reaction to the 9/11 attacks. Well, it turned out that this document stirred up quite a lot of reaction, and both from various sectors of the European intellectual life, and also from various sectors of the intellectual life of the Middle Eastern Arab world. A great many responses came out. One response from the American side to this was to try to bring some of us who had signed the document and some of them who were involved in the response to it into face-to-face meeting with each other. The first effort at this was a conference that was held over several days, I think 4 days in all, in Malta, partly because this was a kind of neutral ground. We couldn't invite the Arabs to the U.S. after all. There would have been visa problems. We Americans might have been in physical danger in some parts of the Arab world, and Malta was a good intermediate place. At the Malta meeting, there were altogether, I'd say, close to 50 people, fairly evenly divided between Americans and Middle Eastern Arab intellectuals, all Muslims, as it happens, but Muslims of different stripes. Most were Sunni. There was one Ibadi Shia. The Sunnis were from all around the Mediterranean world, Lebanese, Syrian, North African, Mauritanian, Algerian, Moroccan. There was one fellow, a Muslim from Spain. There was an Algerian who was living in London. So it was a very broad gauge group. I think there was one Tunisian also in the group. And there were a couple of Iraqi expatriates also in the group. Well, for various reasons, we approached this whole thing thinking that the best way to operate would be for each side to tell the other something about themselves as they understood themselves and about how all of this fitted together with the dialogue that we were supposed to be having. If you follow the debates over intercultural dialogue, you know that there are fundamentally three, and where religion is involved, there are four purposes that may be worked at through such a dialogue. The first is simply to get to know one another, to get to know what each person's or each group's position is. The second is a kind of derivative of that, but this is what happens when you have the two groups not really trying to explain themselves on a level playing field, but when you have one group trying to convince the other group of its own superiority. The offshoot of this in religious, in intercultural dialogue of a religious nature is when you have one group trying to convert the other group or explain to the other group why they ought to convert. At the end of my Grand Mosque lecture during the Q&A, I was actually asked by a faculty member of the Sharia Studies Institute, their entire faculty came to this thing, if I had ever considered converting to Islam. My response was that I thought that we had been placed in our positions in life for a purpose, and that I was trying to live mine out as best I could. That seemed to satisfy him for the moment, but at any rate, he would, if we had been in a dialogue situation of more equal form, I think he would have been doing his very, very best to make me one of his own. Anyway, so you have the level playing field kind of explanation approach. You have the convince the other guy of your superiority approach. You have the religion offshoot of that, which is convince the other guy of your superiority and get him to convert approach. And then the last kind of methodology one encounters is kind of a return to the level playing field mode. That is when you just get together and work on something that is of common interest. So that you might be interested in building a school or trying to carve out a place where violence would be restricted or something of this sort. And you could work on that as a project having a common goal and, in effect, learn about each other, not intellectually, but practically by how you interacted on this project. Well, our purpose in Malta was really the first sort, as befits a group of intellectuals. After all, what do intellectuals do? Intellectuals try to explain things to other people. And it helps if the other people are also intellectuals so that they presumably will understand what you're explaining. And the idea was we would talk a bit about the framework that we Americans were coming from, and more broadly Western culture as exemplified in America. And the Arabs would talk about the Arab approach and so forth. So we would go away having learned a bit and having dialogued a bit and so forth. Well, in this connection, the organizer of the project asked me to talk for about 20 minutes on the idea of just war. No, something is going to... Okay, I was afraid it was me. No, okay. I don't have any implants that I'm aware of, but one never knows. At any rate, I was asked to talk for 20 minutes or 30 minutes on the idea of just war. And I did. My approach to the idea of just war is that we need to think of it in a broad cultural frame. It has religious components. It also has secular components. Historically, it is the basis of the values that were originally transformed into international law, especially where the idea of war is concerned. And to follow through on this is a way of understanding Western culture more broadly, as well as the particular letter, What We're Fighting For, which made use of just war tradition, referring to it both as a religiously engendered doctrine and also as a broad statement of secular values. So I finished, and I thought, that was pretty straightforward, no problem there. Oh, man, I just got savaged because I was accused of promulgating holy war. I was told by one of the Syrians present that what I had just described was exactly the same sort of thing that Osama bin Laden espoused. And this really, I must say, threw me for a loop. My fellow Americans came to my defense, but others on the Arab side joined in the assault. And at the end, it was not one of these situations that one likes to look back on with any pleasure, because it seemed to be divisive rather than unitive. We shifted after that session to other topics, and some of the same tension remained there. But we gradually worked through all of this and decided that at the end of it, after all, being academics at a conference, what do? You figure out what the next conference is going to be on. And so when we got to talking about that, we figured that we were on safer ground and we could cooperate. Well, we had our second conference about a year and a half later was in Casablanca. And in the meantime, something had occurred to me, namely that we were really talking past each other, that the expectations that these people had about the claims that I was making and that others in our group were making about the relationship of religion and the secular were not what we were getting back from them. The assumptions were very different from their side. By this time, the French suburbs where the North African Muslims are congregated had erupted, and things were very different in the Mediterranean Arab world of intellectuals by that point, because the model that had been held up by French society in particular had proven to be a very problematic model, one that did not in fact prevent the uprising in the suburbs, but which seemed to inflame it. Well, I took that as a kind of stepping off point and observed in another presentation I made at the second conference, observed that all the members of the Arab group had some connection with the French educational system. Some had actually studied in France, mostly in Paris, various branches of the Université de Paris. Others were from countries that had been heavily influenced by French culture. We were in Morocco, after all, where the second language is French, where the educational system is shaped on the French model. Syria, another case. Lebanon, a somewhat mixed case, but nonetheless one heavily influenced by this. Indeed, all around the Mediterranean world, the French influence among people of a certain sort is very, very strong. I remembered from a few years earlier when I was in an administrative position at Rutgers that involved me in some intercultural meetings, going to Cairo and in the course of our university discussions, having dinner at the house of a wealthy Egyptian man who also was something of an intellectual. And there were three languages spoken: English, French, and Arabic. All the people in our group were able to handle at least two of these, except for one guy from Rutgers who could get along in English, but not the rest. But the rest of us found ourselves having to move back and forth, and you had conversations depending on which of the two languages it happened that your conversation partner and you both had in common. Well, which of the three languages? We had some people in the group who spoke Arabic, but The rest of us had to depend on French and English. And I was just moving from this experience to realize how deeply the French way of thinking about things had permeated the culture of these gentlemen that we were engaged in dialogue with. Now, it didn't at all help the situation that a number of them were also communists. And, of course, they knew the religion-secular issue through the practice of the Soviet Union, where the same kind of approach that one finds in revolutionary France is what was taken and, if anything, put on steroids. So the notion of the secular as a concept which was not utterly divorced from religion, laïcisme in French, totally divorced from religion, have nothing to do with it. The notion of the secular as something that is not this, which I take it to be the relation of religion to the public order in the U.S., was something that was quite unusual, to say the least, for these Arab intellectuals. What they were thinking as they heard us, we Americans, was that we were trying to press religion into a position of power over the political order. This was not what we were trying to say. So the intercultural dialogue that we were trying to have was not, in fact, one between a group of American intellectuals and a group of Arab intellectuals, each reflecting our own cultures. Rather, it was a dialogue that was skewed by a third party, the French educational system, the French governmental system, and the assumptions about secularity that obtained there. Well, I put this forth at the Casablanca meeting. Didn't get jumped on quite as hard as I had at the first meeting, but I did get accused of trying to tar the Arabs with the brush of anti-French hatred that Americans had exemplified by that point. Again, we made it through the meeting. We got to the point of talking about the next meeting and moved on from there. But I learned subsequently that there were people that had begun to pay attention to this. And the trip to Oman was one of the results. The two lectures I gave there that Woody talked about were further developments of this. I was, in fact, going to follow up on one of those topics tonight, but John Wilson had got there first and had claimed the topic, and so I couldn't cover the same ground he had covered. But the thing that I discovered is that all this stuff takes a while. You know, it really does not. The rather naive expectations that we went to Malta with were dashed, and probably appropriately so, by the vociferous reaction that our comments trying to explain our own culture produced. By the time we got to our third meeting, which actually was held in Malaga, in Spain, which I did not realize, but turns out to be a favorite Moroccan watering place for wealthy Moroccans and middle-class Moroccans who want to get out of their culture and take off their clothes and stand in the sun. By the third meeting, we had discovered that we could talk together about the possibility of a place for religion in society that, and in the political order, that was not one necessarily of hegemony, but nonetheless was one in which there could be a useful contribution. this turned out to be a very welcome idea to a number of the Arab intellectuals who were involved in this, once they got their heads around it. Once they saw that there was really an alternative in the U.S. system that was different from the one that they had known up to that point, which was the one modeled on the French system. The result has been a development of a certain kind of discourse originating from the Arab side, which comes out periodically in literary form. There is a journal published in Oman, interestingly paid for and housed in the Ministry of Awqaf, of Endowments, which is the ministry that is responsible for the upkeep of the mosques. It is also the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and so it's the ministry that's responsible for oversight and support, really, of the non-Muslim religious institutions in the Sultanate of Oman. This journal, Al-Tasamo, Tolerance, is intentionally a journal of outreach to Arab intellectuals over the Middle East, and particularly in the Mediterranean world. And the concepts that are being put forward there, I am happy to say, are concepts which genuinely do engage American ways and American history of thinking about the relationship of religion to public discourse. There are fundamental problems with trying to rethink the whole issue of religion and its relation to the public order within the Islamic world. One of the problems is that if one looks at the tradition that is described in Sharia, the options that are available to you there are relatively limited. However, if one looks at the actual practices of Islamic cultures, one finds that the interpretations of this are quite broad indeed, and the ways in which different Islamic cultures at different times in history have handled the problem or the issue of religious plurality have varied enormously. What I think we have managed to do in this series of conferences is to awaken at least a segment of the Arab intellectuals to the possibility of talking about the possibilities of this plurality in a way that had been closed off by the French intellectual and governmental model. What I think that we on the American side have learned is that we have to be a lot more sensitive to the cultural backgrounds that are not purely associated with the fact of Islamic religion in framing the interactions that go between us. I think we've also, at least I speaking for myself, I think I have also learned that there is a great deal more richness in the historical practices of Islamic communities regarding the handling of religion in the public sphere than one would get from a purely academic reading of the classical literature on this and its particular way of laying out the relation between Islam and other religions. Well, this has been very informal. It has not been very theoretical. As I say, it's been a story, and I think that I would just be happy to have a conversation now. So, yes, sir.
I understand the sentiments that you're expressing, but when I read sort of liberal Muslim thought, right, let's say like in Fadl, there's a book on Islam and democracy.
You're talking about Khalil Abdul Fadl.
Right.
Yeah.
They're very nice books. Any of the books that I've looked at, he has a couple very short books. And he has a position paper, and then he has responses And the conservative Muslim thinkers, to me, are more convincing than his argument. And the same thing I would say when I read about Muslim accommodation of other religions or atheists, right? The conservative thinkers seem to me to have a better grip on the tradition of Islam and the religious texts that, like Bukhari or the Hadith, or the Quran. I mean, so that while the people that you're referring to that you might meet with in Casablanca and you have a drink with them or something like that, they're not the
We didn't do much of that.
Okay, well, they're not the mainstream, they're not the conservative drivers like Khomeini or Ahmadinejad that are driving the Islamic thought. In fact, Ahmadinejad in Iran, Baha'is are very much oppressed, as well as other religions. So, and most history of Islamic societies, even when they've accommodated other religious groups, have always had outbursts of oppression. So it seems to me that the clash of civilization is really there and doesn't need a question mark.
Well, I think you're saying two things. One is that you find the conservative interpreters of Islam to be more persuasive than someone like Abu al-Fadl. I confess I don't, but maybe this is a matter of personal liking or disliking of what's being said. In that connection, there is a recently published book by a good friend of mine, John Kelsey, published by Harvard University Press, and the title, which the press gave it, was Arguing the Just War in Islam. John actually had a title originally that had the subtitle having to do something or other with the crisis in Sharia, the new jihad and the crisis in Sharia reasoning. And that was a much closer title to what the book is actually about, because, of course, there is no just war in Islam as such. But the press people thought that it would sell better if they gave it that title. The reason I bring up this book is that he has a chapter in which he looks at 3 American Muslims of very different sorts, all of whom have explored the roots of democratic thinking in Islamic tradition. Khalid Abu al-Fadl is one of these. The other 2 are Abdulaziz Sachedina of the University of Virginia and Abdullah Naim. I think he's now at Emory. He used to be at Florida. And Naim, Sachedina is a Shia. The other 2 are Sunnis. And Naim actually argues that what true Islam is about is, in fact, democracy. That if you take it any other way, you end up subverting what Islam is about. Well, if you want to pursue this further, you might find it interesting to see what Kelsey says about each of these guys, and then maybe even look at their own position somewhat. My own thinking on the matter of the conservatives versus the liberals is that there really is an intellectual battle going on right now. It is relatively easy in a lot of ways to stake out a very conservative position, either following the model of Wahhabi jurisprudence, which is the route that leads you into the kind of radicalism that Al-Qaeda represents, or following the Imamist understanding of Islam that one finds coming out of the Ayatollah Khomeini and his brain trust. There are a lot of similarities, in fact, between these 2 groups on where they come out on particular issues. But this is, in the big picture, a fraction of the whole. The Wahhabi doctrine is one aspect of one of the schools, one of the major schools of jurisprudential interpretation of Islam. there is a broader debate going on out there. There is a debate that includes jurisprudence in other schools. There's a debate that includes Sufis, who are nominally members of the various schools, but in fact are different in terms of their religious practice and often in terms of their religious belief. There's a debate that is taking place even among the people who theologically are very much, and jurisprudentially, are very much on the same page in a lot of ways. For example, one gets folks that are deeply critical of the whole jihadist movement, who, in terms of their presuppositions, their religious presuppositions, are remarkably close to where the radical jihadists began. Well, I started out by saying that it's relatively easy to be persuasive within the framework of a relatively narrow conservative interpretation of Islam. What I find exciting, frankly, about Abu al-Fadl and Sajidina and An-Naim is that they do know the tradition. They are willing to use elements of the tradition that the conservatives are very shy of, and they're willing to draw these out in ways that are different from the ways that are laid down by the rule of the doors of interpretation being closed. There are other reformist movements in Islam, and you may hear more about this next week, I don't know, but there are other reformist movements in Islam which have a methodology that in many ways is similar to some of the very conservative types, the Salafist methodology, the methodology of getting back to the supposed practices and beliefs of the companions of the Prophet, the people that were closest to him. I first became aware of this some years ago at a conference, well, it wasn't a series of conferences really, that were connected with a project at the Council on Foreign Relations, when I discovered that there was a kind of Muslim feminism that was using a Salafist interpretation of Islam as a way of countering the encrusted notions of Sharia in conservative Islamic cultures, where Sharia was being made to fit whatever the traditions of the local Islamic culture was, rather than the other way around. For these women, the way to get past this was to say, hey, what were the Prophet's companions doing? And how did they behave? And how did the Prophet himself behave? You know, this is the Salafist methodology. Okay, so that's one whole kind of thing. The other thing that you raised is the question of influence. Who's making the decisions? Who's got the power? And frankly, you know, we intellectuals, we academics, ought to be very careful about claiming too much in this regard. We don't have the power. Some of us get drawn into government at different times. One of the people involved in this Malta Casablanca Malaga project is Bill Galston, who was in the White House for a period under Clinton. We've got some others that have had fairly close relations with policy circles in D.C. Michael Novak is another example of this. But the truth of the matter is that we don't make the decisions. And yet, sometimes in ways we don't even anticipate or maybe even don't know about, we do have influence. We shape the way people think about things, the kinds of decisions that come out, and so forth. So I think it's useful talking to these people that we're talking to. I think it's useful to have them tweak our ideas and our perceptions and have us tweak their ideas and their perceptions. The sort of problem that that you're alluding to is generally a problem with intercultural dialogue. The people who are drawn into this are not the people who are the decision makers. They're not the hard actors, because those people have their own circles of interaction, and they have their own agendas when they go into them. But I repeat, it seems to me that there's some real use to this other kind of thing. You had your hand up, sir, and then we'll come to some other folks.
How would you describe the societal differences between France and this country that has resulted in the kinds of riots and disorder that have been taking place in France by comparison to the more mainstreaming of many of the Muslim cultures here?
Well, let me say that France is one example of an attitude that one finds in other French cultures, or other European cultures too, although Europe itself is extraordinarily diverse on this. The fundamental issue is the degree to which the society is open to real integration of outsiders who come in. American society, because of our history, because of our ideology, maybe because of who we are as a people, has proven very open to this kind of thing. And one result has been that we have turned out to transform people from cultures that in some ways might be viewed as alien to us, so that they move into the American mainstream and adopt values and ways that are consistent with the values and ways of others in our society, and so we get along. French culture has trouble with this. Remember the flap over wearing headscarves in French schools. Well, what do you do when this kid wants to wear a headscarf? Well, hey, you don't let anybody wear anything religious. So the Jewish kid has to put the Star of David inside her clothes. The Catholic kid has to put the cross inside her clothes. But the poor Muslim girl can't do that with her headscarf. She can't wear the headscarf under her clothes. Not a headscarf anymore. So she feels discriminated against. I look at this and I shake my head. You know, at Rutgers, in my department, we had a work-study student that showed up in full burqa to work twice a week. And, you know, I never saw anything of her except her eyes and the tips of her fingers. But she was a very jolly, very efficient worker, did the job, got along very well with everybody, and so forth. Who cares that she's dressed in a burqa? But she couldn't have done this in a French state university context. She could not have done this at the University of Paris or any of the other state-run French institutions. She would have had to wear what sort of clothes that the ladies in this audience are wearing.
Where do you see that going in France?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. It seems to me that Sarkozy has a much better, a much more open grasp on this whole thing. Although he was the guy who cracked down hard on the banlieue. But I don't know, because it goes a long way back. It goes all the way back to the revolution. The interesting thing is that as you look around Europe, you find similar kinds of attitudes that are really anti-assimilationist in other societies. And they don't root in a particular ideological way of thinking about the secular. Germans, don't how can you be a Turk and be a German? Has been the issue. There's a good deal of this in Denmark. There's a good deal of this in the Netherlands. And again, it has to do with issues of national identity there rather than with separation of religion and politics there. I just don't know. But I think that the point that I was making about the difference between American society on the possibilities of assimilation and transformation of immigrants, and what one typically finds in a lot of Western European societies is worth meditating on. I don't think this is going to be turned around overnight. Maybe never. There was a couple of hands over here, and then I'll come back. Okay?
I'd like
Yes.
to respond to what you just said. I think that there is a little bit of a confusion between the scarf issue and the riots issue.
And I am hearing a French accent.
Was I'm American.
Okay.
The scarf issue was a religious issue. That's definitely true. The religious issue, the riots issue had nothing to do or little to do with religion. It was an African and Arabic neighborhood that never been called Muslim. And they're very similar to what happened in Los Angeles after the Rodney King beating. They were ethnic, they were economical, but they were not religious. So I'm not sure why you make that that statement that you see the society being so different. We have not been able to assimilate the communities here also at this moment.
Well, we could argue about this, I think, in some detail. I certainly grant your point about the question was, the comment was that I was falsely linking the religious issue of the headscarf with the riots in the North African and other ethnic suburbs where the people were not integrated into the French economic life, and effectively responded to that with violence. Right? Okay. And I was saying in response to that the speaker also went on to suggest that this was more like the ethnic riots, the race riots in places like Los Angeles in this country some time back. So that we have our problems too, and I don't deny this. I do think, though, that it's probably wrong to suggest that there is no religious dimension to those riots in France, because the truth is that Muslim extremists have been moving in those suburbs, those economically depressed and unintegrated suburbs, and preaching a doctrine of religious identity that is an empowering kind of doctrine, and inflames a certain kind of attitude towards the culture that attempts to put a strong separation between religion and culture. This is simply another way, they would say, another way of keeping us down. We identify ourselves as Muslim because that's who we are. And if you tell us that we can't show our being Muslim by the way we wear our clothes or by the kinds of clothes we wear or whatever, then there's something wrong with your society, and we need to try to change that. So it seems to me that I would partly agree with you, but I also partly would disagree. Gentleman back here, and then over here, and then we'll come back to you. Was there anybody in this bunch? I didn't want to leave this group entirely. Yeah.
The three conferences that you've had, they have had more benefit as well. Apparently, in the last week, there was an article where the king of Saudi Arabia was meeting with some Japanese people, and it came out with a statement that there should be a meeting of the three major religions, and that he was thinking about how to do it. So that's quite a statement for him.
Yeah, there have been Saudis involved in this group in varying ways. They haven't been the major players. but there have been Saudis, and they have to be very careful how they operate within their own context. The most active people, by the way, the Syrians basically got shut down. One of them got jailed because of his activity, his pro-democracy activities in Syria, and also because of his association with us. Another one was told, watch out or it's going to happen to you. So they got sat on. The freest of the lot have been the Omani man who is the editor of Tassamo, this very prominent Lebanese academic, and a Mauritanian and a couple of Moroccans who obviously operate under a very different kind of regime. I would not claim that this particular group has necessarily been the motivating factor behind the Saudi king's action. But I think that there are people within Saudi Arabia who are for this kind of interaction, who are perhaps emboldened and perhaps made a bit more, made to think a little bit more creatively about how to get something like this going in the Saudi context as a result of what we're doing. Because the Arabs continue to talk among themselves, even while they're not talking to us Americans. That's the other thing. Yes, ma'am.
My feeling is that, in reference to France, that perhaps there's a matter of scale there, that the number of Muslims compared to the number of French is very different than that in
I think there is a matter of scale, particularly in the Paris area. One finds, though, the same kind of thing in other European societies.
What about the Hispanics in Israel?
Yeah. Well, are you saying that the?
They're not rioting,
No.
but they are being
I'm not sure they are. I mean, look around. Hey, I think that the situation with Hispanic migrants is evolving, and I'm not sure I know where it's going to come out. But we lived in Hunterdon County for 10 years. Just moved from there, as a matter of fact, and my goodness, the number of Hispanic laborers that are involved in the lawn care business, the number of Hispanics that work in the restaurants. There's a Boston market, of all things, that's entirely Hispanic run in Flemington. It just seems to me that we're getting a huge amount of immigration, legitimate and not, from Mexico and Central America in particular, and that what's happening is not that they're setting themselves against American society, but they're becoming Americans, for better or worse. Was there another hand back over here? By the way, let me just mention another very different kind of interaction that I was involved in. These two guys at Catholic U in the law school pushed very hard for a number of years and finally got a dialogue going with a bunch of Iranians. And interestingly, this was supported by the Norwegian government through the International Peace Research Institute, Oslo, who saw this as a way of perhaps having a new Oslo Accord, only this one would be between the United States and Iran. And we met in Rome, as it happened, at a villa south of Rome, and gathered around this large table. And my experience there was like experiences I used to have with Soviet academics. you would get the party line. You would get it laid out in great detail and very persuasively on its own terms. There was very little dialogue. There really was no effort at dialogue on the side of the Iranians. This was an effort to show the superiority of their culture. At least this is the way the thing went for the first several sessions of our meeting. Then one of the Norwegians was chairing, who happened to be a very deeply involved in the Israeli-Palestinian, in settling the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And so regardless of the fact that the session was had an agenda that was supposed to be on a certain topic, he shifted as soon as the presentations were given, he shifted the discussion to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And instead of our talking about U.S. relationships with Iran or better understanding of Shiism and the implications of Shiism for political governance, we found ourselves spending the rest of the conference talking about something that greater minds than ours had not been able to resolve, and which we were not going to be able to do anything about anyway in this group. This was one of the worst examples, it seems to me, of a dialogue that got cut off because of assumptions and biases and agendas that were brought in from outside. Yeah.
In these conversations, did you consider the Turkish model, and how do you think events there might affect that?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we actually discussed this at for some time in the Casablanca meeting, where we were trying to come up with conceptual ways to talk about the positive plural presence of religion within society. There's something a lot like this actually in contemporary Jordan. A different version of the Turkish model was the basis of the Lebanese government, and unfortunately that's pretty much in ruins now. The thing is that the Turkish model, well, on the positive side, the Turkish model could be interpreted in a variety of ways to fit local conditions. Negatively, it still is a model that fits very comfortably under the old Sharia-focused conception of Islam at the head and then the people of the book being tolerated by Islam. Contemporary Turkey evinces this very well, it seems to me. The established Christian churches in Turkey are not allowed to train their own clergy. So they have to bring clergy in from outside. And over the years, the presence of Christianity in Turkey, which once was quite vigorous, obviously, has largely declined to close to the vanishing point. So the Turkish model has some intellectual interest, and there may be some ways of tweaking this model for thinking about plurality of religion in contemporary Islamic societies. But it also is a model that has some negative history to it. I don't know. I rather like the model in principle, but I'm not sure how to make the principle come into practice.
Would you comment on how the internet may be influencing the attitudes of people in Arab countries?
Oh, there is an enormous amount of debate going on the internet. There are more websites than you can shake a stick at that are devoted to this. A lot of them are conservative, but the friends of mine who follow this stuff point out that even the conservative ones are usually fighting with one another over the actual implications of Islam in terms of their interpretive methods. So there is an enormous amount of this kind of interaction going on, and it allows it to reach beyond particular cultures to involve people in other societies as well. The people I know, the academics I know that follow this, find this to be an enormously rich source of information, because it, among other things, helps them to show other people that Islam is not this monolithic terroristic thing that the media, among others, often try to present it to be. Well, over here. Well, actually, there was somebody else over here, I thought.
Just one comment.
Sure.
On the headscarf issue, it wasn't just that France woke up and suddenly discovered headscarves. It was that young girls in the schools who were being oppressed by their co-religionists were not wearing headscarves.
Yeah.
And so the French government said, all right, we can't have that kind of religious oppression. And it's not only the the skull caps that Jewish boys wear were also forbidden. So it wasn't just crosses being put in your shirts. It was a very visible and important sign to Jews. But it was mainly that the co-religionists were oppressing other schoolgirls. And I could easily see that happen in this country, and we would have to pass similar laws, just like stopping kids from wearing gang clothes or gang colors.
Well, I'm not sure of that. I don't know what it's like on the Princeton campus. I know on the Rutgers campus, the decision whether or not to dress in traditional garb is largely an identity one. I can go into a class as an observer where the subject is some aspect of Islam, and I'll see a couple of girls going in arm, one looking like she just came out of Bloomingdale's, and the other one, dressed in head to toe in a traditional outfit. And what I've been told repeatedly is, this is a matter of who I am. It's not anything else, and others have to make their own decisions about this.
I'm talking about what motivated the French government to pass the headscarf law in France was not that they had anything against headscarves.
Yeah.
They were trying to prevent oppression of young girls by their co-religionists.
But they used the separation rule, the laïcisme rule, as a way of laïcité rule. They used this as a way of cracking down on this whole thing in, frankly, I think, a very ham-handed way. So that instead of hitting at the actual problem, which was the problem of coercion, they tried to be even-handed across the board, and in fact struck at issues that struck at people that were not the source of the problem.
Well, it's one way, a reasonable way, I think a reasonable way of combating that kind of problem. Because you can't identify the, Islamists that are oppressing the girls or their fathers or whatever, it is. So that's I think, a very reasonable way of getting the problem. And every time I hear this problem discussed, what led up to the law, right, is never really brought up. It's always, gee, isn't the French government horrible because they're oppressing this expression of self? But that's not what they were trying to do with the law, was allow the expression of self.
Well,
girls could go out of school and put on headscarves if they want.
sure, but they couldn't use them in the school.
Right, exactly. They're not stopping headscarves.
Well,
They're trying to stop oppression.
I certainly see your point, but I don't grant it. It just seems to me that the point I'm trying to make is that the assumptions that are present in the idea of laïcité mean that there really fundamentally can be no role for a religious presence in a state-funded operation. And that inevitably leads you into situations where you're going to miss the actual problem when you encounter a problem. I think this is an unfortunate result of the anti-clericalism of the French Revolution. Yeah.
Maybe one more.
And it'll be you, sir. So you have to make it good.
Question. Some of the problems we touched here on is that we have only a rudimentary definition of Islam. Right after 9/11, everybody hastened to say, now don't take this out on regular Muslim people who are very nice God-fearing and go to church every Sunday. That wasn't.
Well, or mosque every Friday.
That wasn't said. And the question I have is that maybe it is because Muslim is essentially a warrior religion where if you die the right way, you sit in a tent and 40 virgins come. Now, imagine the horror of on St. Paul's face if upon going up the pearly gates, if suddenly those are your 40 virgins. So what I'm saying is that perhaps we don't quite understand the various mechanisms of Islam. Or for instance, when Muhammad came up with the new religion, he was thrown out of Mecca and Medina because in the old religion, Mecca and Medina was a pilgrimage place. So when he was chased away, he changed the doctrine and came back and said, good news I bring, you can be another pilgrimage place. Some of the framework I'm speaking of is, I come from a culture which was occupied by the Turks for 150 years. And perhaps over the 150 years, the intercultural nature of the Muslim religion gave some insight, which probably we have lost by now. We lost, a priest or a minister stands up at the pulpit and talks about religious things. You can find a Turkish, well, not a Turkish, but a Muslim mullah delivering his sermon while leaning on a sword. I don't know whether since swords have gone away. So what I'm saying is that for us to have success in understanding Islam, shouldn't we define Islam?
Well, that may be. That wasn't supposed to be my role tonight. And I take it that the lecture next week is probably going to do more in that direction. But what I would say is that Islam is an extraordinarily varied phenomenon, just like Christianity is, for that matter. There are warrior aspects of Christianity. There certainly is a warrior aspect to Islam. It is not the core of how Islam universally has understood itself, though, nor is it today. If you look at the whole Sufi side of Islam, there is much more in common with certain kinds of Methodism in this country than there is in common with the warrior jihadists of the radical side of contemporary Wahhabism. It is certainly historically the case that Islam spread itself by the sword. It is also, interestingly, the case that a lot of non-Western cultures think that Western culture has spread itself, and particularly American culture, has spread itself by, not by the sword, by the barrel of the gun. I would want us to take a broader look and to, among other things, try to identify those elements of Islamic history, tradition, and contemporary culture that are in real tension with the radical jihadist movement. Because it seems to me that the ultimate response to radical jihadism is going to have to come from inside of Islam, not from outside. We on the outside can perhaps hold it in check, but to ultimately wipe it out is going to be a matter of ideology, of feeling, of culture, and that's going to happen from inside.